think it's time for you to have your lysergic acid. Drink this down and... Mojo Radio. Mojo Radio. We love...
Speak more extensively about authoritarianism. I thought I'd exercise a bit of authoritarianism right now and just inform and welcome you all to another episode of Requiem Radio. I'm your favorite schizo here, Hazy Dialects, with my gang of assortments, my individuals, my husk that are next to the fire in any Elden Scrolls game. We have here our patriot, our man who currently is trying to explain to us one of the most complex JoJo characters, Sola Requiem.
Yeah, Patriot, stand front or stand by, whatever Orange Man says. I don't know, it's been forever. But yeah, hey guys, welcome back to, this is going to be season 2 finale. We were going to have Problem of Evil Part 2. Unfortunately, due to unfortunate circumstance, a lot of them couldn't make it, so we just thought, scratch it. And just have an episode where... Yeah, let's just say it like that. You know, just have an episode of us, like, you know, myself, Hazy. We got John, and we actually got Earnest. So both of them already been on the show before. Ernest season 1, John season 2. And it's just really us just chilling, shooting the shit, happy hour stuff. So, you know, it's us shooting our thoughts, just talking. Right now, we're talking about the subject for the connotations of what is fascism and, like, what are the distinctions between it that separates it from other ideologies. And mainly, it was brought up by how I felt it to be the overuse of the word in modern, like, discourse, where it's like everyone and their mother calls out fascism, and it's like, okay, is this basically just becoming anything I don't like is literally Hitler, or are we actually meaning fascism? So that's really just the discussion we're having right now.
Yes, and to add on to that, it's kind of like Yu-Gi-Oh! You know, how there's a little bit of power creep that happens in it. And
did you really compare fascism to Yu-Gi-Oh? Anyway,
Maxi is a great card, but power creep also happens in common parliament as well. We often see people just throw out words without really understanding the meaning or significance, or why it should have a higher threshold when we're vetting these words out. Nowadays, you can't lie to somebody or just be a little mischievous when you're being dishonest. You're gaslighting them. You're unironically putting them through a Lifetime movie. You know, there's a lot of that acceleration within discourse to the point where these words don't invoke the same thing anymore. To the point where even if a word such as being called fascist is being used nowadays, I have no idea what someone's conveying by this point. Is it just that they like Elon Musk? Did he like a tweet or something? Or did he unironically think that, you know, when it comes to my thoughts about the Jews, I don't want to be left in the echoes, you know? Beyond all jokes aside, I just wanted to get into your discussion. And John, you were saying something earlier, but I didn't want to cut you off too much. So do you remember what exactly you was talking about?
No, because you cut me off too much.
Yes,
I'm kidding.
I'm effective authoritarian. Sorry.
Yeah, John, you're talking about the distinction between, like, fascism, authoritarianism, and all these other isms, I guess.
Yeah, not much of distinction, but rather the lack of distinction when it comes to the use of these terms. You see it every day. The way that people are, when they call someone a fascist, they are like thinking about in not that much of the way that people use Nazi, but instead of, but I guess you can say sometimes it's like with less racial connotations to it. It's just kind of like you're saying that this person here, you know, has some like heterodox politics that, you know, require like that the state does something that he wants or something like that, something undemocratic, you can say. So it kind of like the way that fascism sometimes is used by certain people, especially people like, you can see this, you saw this quite a while, really, actually, I guess you can say like after post-World War II, like it's just to say someone that is like an authoritarian or a totalitarian, nothing much really to it and all that. But again, you know, I think that this is just very too abstract when talking about fascism and how it is applied properly to speak of like what happened in Italy and to a certain extent what happened in Germany there, because it's not as though like it's just merely the aspect of totalitarianism that made them fascist though. like if that were the case, then we can call any totalitarian, quote unquote, totalitarian state a fascist state. But even the term totalitarian itself is a very recent one to describe what a condition of the state. And and that's kind of the issue that I take it eventually. It becomes, at that point, we're just getting very too abstract to speak of like conditions of every states when like this only happened in very specific states themselves. So what I mean, like, it gets very abstract. It's just that it gets very all-encompassing of like different states. And at the same time, it kind of reduces not to a political ideology, sometimes even to it also sometimes reduces to like a psychological state too. This is something that you find with certain people, especially that Umberto Eco's like 14 points of fascism, which I've seen at least one or two people use that as an authority to describe like, what does it mean to be a fascist, or that you're in a situation of like that of a fascist state or so, something in those terms. And it's mostly like these things that are very, like I said, more encompassing than what it is. That it basically loses its sort of very specific connotations for it to speak about like Italy and how it developed in the early 20th century, and how its states sort of developed in the early 20th century and all. And so I say that, like, it's usually that's kind of the issue that you have with this term fascism, is like the way that people loosely use it almost as interchangeably with these sort of things that applies more than to just the state of Italy in the 20th century or so. But like, that's one of the issues that I take from that. It's like, why even use this term when we can just simply use maybe totalitarianism, which I still have an issue with that, even with that term to a certain extent. That's one of the problems. There's another problem that I can point out that's more clear as to what is the problem, at least academically, with the issue of the use of the term fascism, because in academia it's no better the way that like people try to study these things, and but I'll get to that later when it becomes a bit much more relevant.
Yeah, and the thing about academia that irritates me so much is that we actually have like political theory and accounts of what is fascism from like the 20th century. And it wasn't until recently that academia got hijacked, that all of them purposely, when describing it, use it almost like a brute club, as in we're going to make this as vague as possible and tag it on anyone that we disagree with. Because I remember there was an old friend of mine who, not going to name her name, but they were very much, liberal, Democrat type person, hashtag trust the state always. And I noticed they called everything, fascism. I asked them, what is fascism? They sent me a Vogue article, and then on the title was like, this, paper is put together by like top political theorists of the times. And it was the most vague things possible. I'm like, okay, you guys are just trying to describe basically, like, if you were to apply this, like, historical figures from ever, like 99% of them would be considered fascist. That means Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, like all these guys, Napoleon, they're all fascists now, which I think is very, what's the word? The Occam's razor in a sense, where it's like very belittling and doesn't actually look at the critical stuff that we're trying to examine. Like, okay, what is this really?
I mean, it becomes very nebulous through this.
Yeah, where it's just like, if you're making the definition so vague where anything could be this, why even have the definition,
Yeah,
like, it doesn't make sense.
And you put it in a context where you cannot even conceive of something like fascism, because, like I said, if you were to just kind of like look at like pre-modern states and the way that they kind of like operate, how they organize and all that, and you just try to point to one aspect of it, like say that they tend to be a bit much more, let's say, quote unquote, ethnocentric and all that, like they would say that, oh, that's fascism, something like that. And that doesn't really, say anything at that point. And it's also very anachronistic too, because again, fascism, properly speaking, is a defined, political, you could say, ideology, but it is a defined political movement that emerged within a certain history, especially in Italy, given that the conditions that it was in relation to other states. And it's not as though like fascism was just this thing that just came out of nowhere and then people just got enlightened and say like, well, this is what happens with every state whenever it becomes, I don't know, totalitarian and nationalistic or something like that. That's kind of where it becomes like, that's what I mean about that. I think Hazy dialectics use the proper term nebulous, But I would say also it's very people tend to be very anachronistic also with that term. I don't think you cannot call any state prior to at the very least the 19th century fascist in the proper sense of what that term is. That encompasses understanding of corporatism, understanding of unionism to a certain extent, and a lot of other things with it. It's not this sort of like, this eternal state of like conditions of states in general. That's the issue that I take on that.
I want to extend that thought just a bit out, is that usually fascism is a subordination of the masses at large to the greater cause. But usually in fascism is either the race or the state in of itself. So usually if we're talking about like basic pittance of underpinnings of fascism, that is usually what we're looking towards. And when we usually evaluate the birth of nations like America and the emphasis on liberalism and individuality to a stronger extent, these aren't comparable. And so sometimes it is inherently pretty disanalogous. And I think often enough that fascism can provide an emergency towards an idea or a problem, but unfortunately the discourse dissipates out because most of the conversation isn't accurately articulating as to what is the problem, and mostly becomes a deliberation about correct terminology. Like, I believe that if there is a valid problem that is to be uprooted by society, I think going about it by using terminology in this way often completely poisons the conversation and discourse at hand.
Well, I got a question for you guys. I've always saw fascism. So all these isms came from the death of monarchy following, the post-Enlightenment, where you have these concepts of like liberalism, conservatism, and then you had other ones creep in, such as, later down the road, like Marxism. So you see 1970 Russian Revolution, where the Marxists overthrow the Czars and stuff like that. And I'd say truly that'd be like the last death of like an actual monarchy. So you have a lot of people who are disenfranchised being like, okay, World War I rolls around, we lost to like liberal capitalism, basically. We lost to like the Allies. And then on the right side, we have Marxists absorbing a lot of our territory. What do we do? Because both these people hate us. And in a way, through a birth of this, they create a reactionary idea to like both of them, where it's reactionary to both capitalism and Marxism, where they have this new, quote unquote, phoenix come up and be like, okay, we're fascism now. Like, we're going to roll through both of you. And that's something a lot of people don't think about correctly, especially when looking at World War I and II. It wasn't, to me, a battle of countries. It was a battle of ideals, of like which one of our groups is going to have the reigning ideal that's going to lead us into the next century. And that battle, quote unquote, ended, after the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, where global liberal capitalism won out. Hence why the world we live in today is predominantly globally liberal capitalism, because capitalism killed both fascism and it killed both Marxism and communism. These nations fell while, capitalism rose. And I'm not saying this as a positive or negative, it's just stating a historical fact. That's what a lot of these things were. That's how I always viewed it. But what are you guys' thoughts on that? And Ernest, I know you're busy right now, but if you want to chime in whenever, feel free to, man.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that when it comes to fascism itself, it's a bit much more tricky, because it's not as though like it just came in World War I. Like I said, fascism didn't develop out of nowhere. It was a long sort of, it came from a long development of the circumstances of like the economy on the one hand. Not to be too much of a Marxist on this point, but that was one of the conditions during the time of like Italy after the Risorgimento, in that sort of state of like being this one nation, which was a bit of odd in some respects here. Because
would you not agree though, post World War I was like the straw that broke the camel's back then, that led to the birth of fascism? I could agree that it's always been lingering, but it came out from World War I, I'd say.
Well, to a certain extent, yeah, but not necessarily. But it came out of like prior developments on like Italy's intellectual intelligentsia, and also like the political situations there too. because you had different movements that were trying to figure out what is the next step for Italy. That was kind of the way that fascism sort of came about as an intellectual movement, which sometimes a lot of Marxist historians and Marxist intellectuals, they always try to downplay this side of things to say that, oh, it's all brute, it's all might means right thing and all that. To a certain extent that is true, but that's not the whole story of the way that fascism actually developed out of. There were in Italy, you had an intelligentsia of people, of Marxists, of anarchists, and also of nationalists, and they all saw themselves that they were they were in a rut. Italy was not in the best conditions right now. It was under the subject of plutocratic entities, external entities, and all that. And one of the things that came from the Marxists was the inability to go for socialism. Why did they thought about that? Well, because Italy wasn't industrialized at the time. If you had a sort of a very sort of basic idea of what Marxism, Marxist analysis of the economy and the development of socialism to communism and all that, you first need to go to capitalism before you can have socialism. But Italy was not capitalist, so they were okay, so this is basically a dead end. And so what do we do now? So they were basically in a third world sort of, you could say, in a third world sort of state of things. So we actually, if we want socialism, we need to industrialize first. So that was the thing about what the Marxists concluded in that condition there. This was one of the first instances of where you get the trajectory towards what is later called fascism. And then it came alongside with the anarchists and the nationalists coming together and trying to sort of piece these things out properly. That's just speaking to the intellectual side of where fascism came from, which is why I said before, Marxists historians and intellectuals nowadays have a very terrible reading of fascism. One of the definitions that is most commonly used by Marxist intellectuals in academia is to say that fascism is capitalism in decline. And again, if fascism was capitalism in decline, how did Italy become fascist without having capitalism? That's the issue that I say. That's one very basic issue that the problems in academics, sort of interpretation of fascism. And I say academics, what I mean here is our Marxist intellectuals in general. Marxist nowadays analysis of fascism is usually the worst when it comes to understanding how did actually fascism developed, to the point that they just really don't look into the primary sources of these things. There's only very few people I can think of that actually did the legwork of looking into the primary sources of the intellectual movements that led to fascism. And those are accessible, so it's not these aren't necessarily something to get into and all that. I mean, of course, yeah, you need to know Italian for the primary sources, but you already have academics around that actually did the legwork in translating these things and having a better, proper understanding of how this came to be, how fascism came to be. And then going through one of them was A. James Gregor, who he has a couple of books on both fascism and Nazism, I think. I know that he has one dedicated to Maoism, where he at least concedes that Maoism is much more closer to the fascist sort of enterprise than it was for another Marxist sort of enterprise in general and all that. And he can explain actually how that is without getting into these sort of convoluted or very nebulous sort of characterizations of totalitarianism or authoritarianism or something like that. But anyway, yeah, that would be what I would say on that regard there. Fascism is not capitalism decline. That's what the Marxists say. And the reason why fascism is not capitalism decline is because, Italy wasn't capitalist when it became fascist. So that's what I would say on that.
I think, interesting enough, a lot of philosophers also kind of help the backbone, at least in terms of fascism, at least at the crux of it. I believe there's a stronger survive mentality that is there, only the strong, or survival of the fittest should be it. While liberalism to some regards believes in the universal man, some ideas that might be accredited to fascism is Darwinism or social Darwinism, hereditariness, race, and the how much innately your environment affects you. And these biological in-groups are naturally the identifiers of like how groups should be unified on a nationalistic foundation. Even reading some of Mein Kampf, there's that continuous, like, even though they were under different rule, he spoke towards this notion or idea of them innately knowing just their own songs, or like having this proclivity to sing the national anthem of Germany. So I do believe those are like the underpinnings that really encourage and bring those sort of ideas of fascism to the forefront. It's not just simply power or an enforcement of power through states, so because some people just believe it to be under those regards. But no, I think there's a dismissal of the universal man, rather, and assumption grounded in it that collectivism to this regard is the only way to like ensure, survival and the advancement of society, the Ubermensch and all that. So it's very fascinating to constantly go back and read these things. Whereas opposed, even if there are like monsters birthed out of Marxism, at least there is like the opposite opposed. Well, not entirely. There was some issues with Marxism in terms of like the rejection of materialism and determinism in that regards. So, but still, I still think one of the biggest like pillars to being a fascist, or like the ideas I discussed earlier.
Yeah. Ernest, do you want to chime in on anything, man? Saw you want to speak earlier.
Yeah. So like, let's get back to the that like sort of like meme definition, capitalism in decline, right? Like, I think people make these they make these declarations like not based on what they think Italy, like developed fascism out of, but what they're considering to be modern analogies. And I agree that they're like very often erroneous, but that's important.
How does I know, Ernest, out of all of us here, you're probably most read on like Marxist thought. How would dialectic materialism answer or like suggest like how fascism was born then? Like, what's your guys' response to that in that sense? I know he was saying he had connection issues earlier, so he may drop and come back. I wouldn't mind touching back on that, like dialectic materialism.
Yeah, I mean, I did make the claim. Well, I did make the claim that they do attempt to explain it, but they just get into these sort of nebulous sort of characterizations. Like I said, like the capitalism decline thing is not just simply what some Marxists said, but these were actual sayings of academics.
Academics for this? I thought this was like something like memers.
No. This was one of the points that Gregor, in his explanation, in his book on the intellectuals, Mussolini's intellectuals, he explained that there were academics that were declaring this. Not all Marxist academics would say that this capitalism decline, but there were some who did say it. Some others were also trying to give this sort of explanation of like the capitalism as being what eventually brought up like fascism and all that. As to right. Like what a Marxist dialectician would, like, let's say a dialectical materialist would say on that. Yeah, I don't know what will be a consistent sort of view of that, so I'll just leave that to those who know about it.
Yeah, what you got?
There's another one too, right? That's like I think you hear it like more recently as well, which is like fascism is imperialism turned inward, right? And like, to your point, well, Italy had not yet developed into a capitalist state. You couldn't really say that Italy had developed into an imperial power at that point either, right? So we could also rule that definition out in that same context, right? I think it just comes down to like people wanting to use this label and applying it to things that just, they're not necessarily going to be very apt. But then again, like in the way that we would define fascism anyway, I think that vague there's also the love of slapping it on everything too, right? Like, because it does have a lot of like fuzziness and gray areas to it that people just be like, hey, if I squint hard enough, I see it right there. We're doing it right now. There it is. It's fascism.
I'd like to think on that too. Another word that gets used constantly a lot that irritates me is when people say reactionary. I never really understood what they meant by that, because wouldn't, by like technicality, all the like ideologues that are around today like reactionary to one prior that we replaced? So I could say like capitalism is reactionary to mercantilism. Mercantilism is reactionary to feudalism. Feudalism is reactionary to communalism. Like, you just keep going back and back and back until you have like Neolithic era, which is a bunch of like people with like intents and stuff. And I always wondered, like, that something doesn't make sense. And I especially hear this of a lot of leftist people, especially like breadtubers. They'll call everything reactionary. And I'm by reactionary, are we talking about by your beliefs and standards? Because the moment your quote unquote party or beliefs pushes a position, I'm like, hey man, I think that's a bit too far. We shouldn't go there. I'm now branded a reactionary because I disagree with the latter, basically. So for, let's say, you know, someone who's a tanky, or yeah, like let's use that, a tanky, like a Stalinist. Would everyone right of Stalin be reactionary then, because they don't go as far as like this guy? And that's something I always found a bit weird. Do any of you guys know more about that whole thing, reactionary? Want to elaborate on more? I know Ernest, we've had conversations offline about this too a while back.
Yeah, I'll say very quickly that like reactionary, historically speaking, was in relation to the revolution, and in this case, like the Revolution of France. So it was kind of used almost as interchangeably as the term conservative. To be a reactionary, at least historically speaking, is to kind of label someone as being against, like, you know, the revolution, the revolution in some respects. There, those connotations in some way they are still there. But yeah, people also use that term reactionary very loosely around nowadays, almost to say just something indistinguishable from that of a fascist sometimes. But I would argue that like by the sort of historical use of the term reactionary, fascism is not reactionary, and because contrary to like a lot of popular opinions, fascism was a revolutionary enterprise. It came from revolutionary movements in trying to figure, you know, what is the next step for us as a people, as a nation, and all. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember getting into a back and forth with an old mutual of mine. He was trying to tell me that libertarianism is a reactionary ideology, which I was confused at, because I argued with him a lot of those thoughts, like, you know, the laissez-faire and libertarianism came from some of the founders of the revolution, of like the French Revolution. And I kind of drew the point to him where I'm saying like, hey, if your new definition of reactionary, because he tried to argue with me, well, the word evolves. I'm like, okay, I can entertain the idea of a word evolving, but if you're telling me that your new definition of the word reactionary would label the literal founder of the word who coined the term and posed this as a reactionary, does that beg the question, maybe we've gone a bit too far with our use of this vernacular? Maybe we shouldn't be calling the literal founder of this like reactionary? It's kind of like in a weird way how, like, you know, people like Bernie Sanders, for example, was like preaching really big, being like, oh, I'm pro-feminism. This was a couple years ago. He went on a stage, he got shoved off by like these two cows, basically, who were like these pink-haired women, and then they're like feminists. They're like, no, this is our chance to speak now. And I'm like, it's kind of like an eat your own mentality, where I'm like, now Bernie Sanders, he's not woke enough for us, he's not pro-feminist enough for us. And I'm like, well, you guys just threw away the dude who was like helping you. So sorry for the bit of a ramble. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
I do agree that it's like it does pretty much just operate as a stand-in for the word conservative, which is why I think as our old boy Volpix was arguing that, like, you know, it changes over time. And like, sure enough, like if you were a royalist, you know, like back then during the French Revolution, like you reactionary, right? Like even I don't know, like even the furthest left in you know, like the French government, like as far as where they advocate for like, you know, like it's like women didn't even have the right to vote, right? So in a modern context, like that's reactionary, right? Like if like Americans who you like, you know, sometimes you know, just run into, and they'll say you know, on Twitter or whatever, just like posting repeal the 19th Amendment or some shit, you know, I think it's like, I think it's fine to say that's reactionary, even though under the original definition, like it technically wouldn't be. But I don't know. I mean, as long as you're just thinking about it as a stand-in for conservative, I don't really consider it to be like, I don't know, some outlandish usage of the term.
Yeah, I could see too. Go ahead, John. John.
So that's why I said, like, the historical application for a reactionary, it was in a way almost interchangeable with conservative, but to be more precise, it was also to speak of someone who was against the revolution. So this was applied to people who were seemingly not on board with the, sort of like to say, the revolutionary principles too, and all that. That's why that's why some leftists will call other leftists reactionary or counter-revolutionary, I guess you can say. But counter-revolutionary sometimes is applied very loosely around too, especially the way that this is assigned to people who did fought the revolution. Can be applied, they can be said to be counter-revolutionary in that sense. There were people like Joseph de Maistre, for example. He is a conservative in the proper sense of the term of the French politics, but he was also like a reactionary, given that he was against the revolutionary principles. You can say that, but again, like a reactionary was also used more very loosely in the sense of like, wow, this person here may seemingly, be a revolutionary, but he actually is, someone who's against the revolutionary principles and against the revolution in its whole and all that. That's sometimes how it was at least historically sometimes used around. It doesn't, and this is going to apply to the whole left and right dichotomy. Many of these terms really, to a certain extent, don't apply today, at least in the American political arena and all that. I think that properly speaking, left and right and conservative and liberal, I guess you can say, are proper to a certain extent. They may have different connotations today than it was about maybe 10 or 20 years ago. But I think they do have a more consistency than, say, like the term reactionary. I don't think that in the American political scene it makes sense to use that term around. Speaking, unless you are to point out that there is a revolution or so, for example. I guess you can say that. I think you can probably say you can probably use it if you were to point me out what is the revolution, what are the revolutionary principles that are being contested or so. I guess I guess. I mean, that's to give a bit credence on that term there. But anyway.
I wanted to bring something up earlier that I thought about. I was just belaboring on for quite some time about the whole notion that fascism is capitalism on decline. And one of the fascinating things about it is that usually the tenets of how it is that case is that usually there's a swapping of certain principles and beliefs that are done so or are sacrificed for the purposes of understanding that capitalism is at its breaking point and that extreme right-wing ideologies, those who have this ideology, are basically changing out certain elements of the beliefs for the purposes of ensuring control, basically dictatorial power, national fervor, and the suppression of dissent to like promote like a strong authoritative like central power. But usually when I look at capitalism as number one, typically there is that individual aspiration to it all. The decline, or let's just accept at face value, the decline of capitalism. I think a lot of core tenets that are assumed by this rigor to just to dissipate for the sake of control just seems like a big buy-in task of anyone who believes in that sort of individualism. Most, at least in terms of current capitalists and even conservatives to some degree, not far-right conservatives, of course, but just average conservatives wouldn't be espousing the notion that you have to forsake all individuality to ensure retaining capitalism and just jump to this biological essentialism, because for most people the system of capitalism is sort of that implicit buy-in that an individual, regardless of intrinsic characteristics can aspire to be the highest degree of this society, regardless of whether or not how tangible you believe that to be. But it seems like to me at the very least, a very perplexing way to just implicitly assert that these are all the knobs that were just automatically altered by the decline of the system as it exists. So that was just something I was just belaboring off a little bit.
Yeah, but that kind of just pushes the goalpost and begs the question for what do you mean by capitalism then? Where I'm not trying to be nitpicky, but for having a conversation about where these words are definitions, like what is your definition of what capitalism is?
It wasn't for me the bigger problem. I'm talking about more or less my issues with Leninist evaluation of fascism as capitalism on decline. Like somehow just by the desire to retain control of the system as it exists, like the higher ups or the people who have, let's say, even say the monopoly of control and power, are just going to have this drastic alteration of values and beliefs to just become these individuals who believe in this intrinsic Darwinism, like as an alternative to something of capitalism. So that's my issue with that analysis. That like it's swapping out a core tenet that I don't think just gets drastically altered that quickly, and I don't think the masses at large who operate in the capitalist system just can make that switch relative. Like,
yeah, and I kind of asked the question, what is that called? I know it's a fallacy. I forgot the name of it, where I pitch you something, but baked into my definition or like my axiomatic beliefs that you don't agree on. So by you even engaging it, you like, implicitly got to agree with like a lot of my beliefs and stuff like that. So like an example would be when engaging with a Marxist, if you were to talk with them about X, Y, or Z, and they're going to talk to you about things such as, what's the word they like to use a lot? They like to use forced labor a lot. What's another one? Where you're taking advantage of someone against their will. I'm blanking on the word. Someone help me. What is it they call Marxists say it? Ernest, you there? Exploitation. Sorry, exploitation. Yeah, so they use words like that, like exploitation. It's like, okay, we have very different definitions for what the word exploitation means. Because they'd see like a guy who's like a factory owner, making more than a dude who's like on a labor job, like doing his thing, making more, like the factory owner making more than a labor worker. They're like, oh, that's exploitive because he's making more money than him. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that being exploitative, because I would say, well, the entrepreneur, the businessman, is the guy who took the higher risk to start this business and hire him, and they like agreed to join that company. It's like a risk reward thing. So
yeah, the problem is what you're getting at is sometimes a lot of these arguments, to engage with them requires to entertain some implicit buy-ins that you might not necessarily agree with. It's like, okay, if even I were to say, like, for example, the exploitation of workers, my threshold for exploitation is drastically different than someone who would be a communist, who would say that any incongruency between what someone at the top helm, regardless of complexity of work and contribution to the company at large, it is an ill upon the world that they are getting treated differently despite the impact on the work that's being done here. So that's the moments where you have to kind of reject the implicit buy-in to even engage. Like, yeah, we can have this conversation about exploitation, but we have to agree upon what exploitation even means, because I don't think we're operating with, when you invoke that phrase, me and you are meaning entirely different things.
No, exactly. And that, I would like to hear, John or Ernest chime in this as well, what leads to more of a bigger question. How do you engage with people who use the same words as you, but have completely radical different definitions of said words? So I know John and I, we do this a lot when we talk about, God in our Catholic spaces, where a lot of people come in and they have a very drastic definition of what God is from, you know, the traditional Abrahamic view of what God is, and then we end up getting a stalemate there. But Ernest, you want to chime in on that really quick, man?
Yeah, so like, is there just a single definition, you know, like exploitation or to be exploited, or someone and exploit them? Like, I would say no. I mean, I would argue just with about any other thing that there's going to be like gradations of exploitation, right? Like we could talk about like the many differences between labor coercion, you know, like in to people that's going to include things like the value of your work, you know, being sent to the fucking person who owns the factory or whatever you were talking about in your example, right? Like, I think definitionally you can say that's exploitative. It's just not as exploitative, you know, as I don't know, like indentured servitude or chattel slavery or immigrants' work contract or something in Qatar. They're just not the same thing.
Yeah, would you then, on the word exploitative, follow the belief that just because someone consents to something doesn't mean it's not exploitative? Would you agree with that? So let's say that you have like a landscaping company. Yeah, do you get what I'm saying? Like, you're running a landscape company, I show up and you're like, hey, I'll pay you like $2 an hour, and me and you both know it's like BS, but I'm like, all right, I'll do it anyway. And although we consented it, I'm working 99 degrees outside in the hot sun cooking, and you know, just not in good conditions. We consider that exploitative, even though me and you both consented and agreed. Yeah. Saying that's good.
I mean, it's not particularly exploitative, but like again, that's why we describe different gradations. There are other times and places that we could look, you know, even in the United States, for example, where you know, we might view something as exploitative, even though there's clearly like, hey, you agreed to take no sort of thing. But I don't know, like I do that in many of these, you know, in which people found themselves under at-will employment, you know, long tree, and of course, in many places all over the world. Would you argue that there's no exploitation going on there because the people agreed to take the job?
Yeah, I would say, for my view of like exploitative, I'd agree that majority of the time, if it's consent based, I don't see it as exploitative. But I'm not an absolute in that statement, as in I know there's going to be exceptions to the rules, kind of like examples you're giving. Like for me, one of my exceptions I make is in regards to like sex work and prostitution, where looking at like the whole industry of like, you know, sex work as it is behemoth. A lot of it, although, you know, these like 18-year-old like girls are like signing away, being like, all right, I signed a contract, I'm in now. To me, I still find that very egregious, disgusting, and exploitative, because a lot of those contracts are like 40, 50, 60 pages thick, where they hide things in between the line, where it's like, okay, we basically own you now, and you signed off to this. Where to me, like, I say that's different from me and like a libertarian, because I know John and I, we were arguing with like Praxben on this actually, in regards to like prostitution. We're like, hey, we still see this as an exploitative act, even though she agreed to do these things. Because a lot of that is like, you know, red paperwork type stuff, where it's like underneath it, like, oh, you may have agreed to sign up on here, but there's other things included, you know, terms and conditions apply type stuff.
Because that was a situation in which we were really, the fundamental disagreement is that we don't think that like consent is like the one signifier that determines whether something is legitimate or not. At least in that conversation we were having with Praxben there.
Yeah, it was the consent-based morality discussion, where me and you were saying we don't really agree with a consent-based morality instruction, like as ethics, basically.
Would you guys both say that?
Sure.
Well, then I have to ask, what do you think makes something like? What would you believe to be? All right, so I think the delineation that can be created here is you believe that there is unethical forms of consent and that there are ethical forms of consent. What would you describe as an unethical form of consent? Like in which somebody has agreed to something, but there are extenuating factors that would still make the action immoral.
Yeah, so this is the one I always use, for example, where I ask people saying, well, let's say you have like a 12-year-old, you know, girl who she's really rational, reasonable, mature, and then you have like a 60-year-old man who's like really sleazy, bit of a scumbag. and both of them consent to engage in sexual acts, in which she says like, oh, although I'm 12, I'm very smart for my age. I know what I'm doing here. In that scenario, I would still say no, I don't want to allow this, and I want that 6-year-old man to get locked up in prison, because I think it's disgusting. Because to me, he's taking advantage of like a child, even if she's quote unquote rational and able to consent. Like, there's things like that. I'd say like incest too. Like, I don't care if you and your sibling consented to engage in like sexual activity. It's a big no for me. Honestly, a lot of this, John, I'd like to hear your opinion too, revolves around like, sex ethics really. Because a lot of stuff in regards to that, I don't believe consent-based morality is sufficient to answer these questions that are like very egregious and disgusting.
Yeah, John, what's your thought on
The piping hot take of saying that it's wrong for a 60-year-old man to have sex with a 12-year-old. Damn, I didn't expect such things that like from you, Sola. That's too hot, man.
Please do not use the phrase "piping hot" next to a 16-year-old. Thank you.
Yeah. No, it's just
Wait, who's 16?
I mean, yeah, my take on that, well, not my take on that specifically is just that in general, like, I don't think the consent-based ethics is sufficient on its own. I think that it's not that consent is never a factor. It's just that we're not operating simply on the basis, on the basis of whether or not people are okay with something. People can be okay with something like murder. And people can try to justify this within a consent-based morality or ethics. I guess you can say more ethics or in that regard there, because, well, like in a murder, you're just you're taking away a life without their consent or so and all that. But that's where you get to like the euthanasia sort of like rationale there, and like assisted suicide or stuff like that. Which again, it's not for some people. People can see that. You see nowadays that some people are okay with it because they have in some way internalized, or at least just enmeshed themselves into that sort of way of looking at things, where it can be legitimate insofar as people happen to agree with the circumstances on their own and all that. But again, that's not really what defines, for example, like, organized, crime or anything like that. It's not just the matter of like consent that is at work there. Or even like the first like sort of thing that we are considering, and maybe something that helps as a rule of thumb to be able to at least get into an ethical discussion, I guess. But it's not really sufficient enough to be able to answer like why we are agreeing on these things in the first place. I think at that point we're just getting into more of like the considerations of like the good of like man, and those things like the good of community and all those things, which at that point we're not simply considering consent as like the fundamental principle, or something like a self-ownership in the sense of like what I say is this sort of like a very sort of liberal understanding of like the self and all that. But anyway, I'm just gonna put that on the side there. But yeah, like I would say that like you're going to find yourself where you cannot give. Or you cannot give a very consistent or very clear sort of condemnations to things like Sola mentioned incest and alongside other things there. And so it comes down to really understanding what is like the good of man, and these things need to be talked out. They don't always have to be like, it doesn't always have to be like a debate on it. Just simple conversations can at least help you start from there on and all. But this will get also enmeshed into the other things of like considering what is the good of like a society and one's own society, I guess you could say, which is not to try to relativize the whole issue of ethics and all that. It's just that I do concede that the application is not always going to be like absolute. But like the guiding principles in regards to how we determine where something should be like is legitimately allowed or not, something is whether or not we are considered in relation to goods, and so like yeah. No, I would say that consent-based ethics as like say the starting point is not sufficient enough. Yeah.
Would you say, John, on that you'd agree with more of like Aristotelian ethics or like Aquinas' ethics? Because me personally, like I've been starting to read it because I finished Plato's Republic recently and I'm on Aristotle now. But a lot of that is interesting, and someone gave me a good analogy for it where they said, let's say you're walking down a street and you're seeing a grandma getting mugged, basically, and your first instinct is to rush over and stop that. Aristotle would argue, like, actually, that's not a good act. You just blindly rushing in there. You know, it's too hyper altruistic. But Aristotle would also tell you, okay, you walking by and doing nothing is also moral. And he says the best judgment call we can make is like in the middle of that, between being hyper altruistic and, you know, hyper selfish, where you only care about yourself. Where Aristotle would argue, like, in this scenario, it would be best to call some form of authority to get there and like help with the situation as your first option, and a last resort should be you should be able to stop the person if you could, you know, to the best means you're capable of. And that's something I found interesting a lot with virtue. I know, Athenian, don't kill me if you're listening to this, but virtue ethics, I know he doesn't like me using that word, but it's very much middle ground where it's case by case, and that's why I like about it a lot, because it kind of is steps on like consequentialist thought, deontological thought, where it's like, well, not every single scenario is going to be 100% all the time. You need to look at it more in the middle road here. What is the best thing you could do case by case for the common good? And that's something I find to be very poetic, and I would personally say it describes a lot of my ethical foundation and beliefs. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that in general?
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken about this before you. It's not like this is an area where I am very developed on. Like, I haven't finished the Nicomachean Ethics, for example, and all that. But I did, you know, like have considerations of like ethics in general and all that, where I do have come to a position similar to Athenians, not exactly, but like in the sense that like all ethics in some sense is going to reduce to the consideration of what virtues are. Because it's not a matter. It's ultimately not going to be like a matter of like a systematized like set of rules, or even that like just merely the consideration of like, you know, what the consequences and stuff like that. It's going to be by relation to what is the good, and virtues are like the means. It's not that virtues is like a middle way between, you know, excess and non-excess or something like that. It's more that virtues are the means by ways that one can achieve such goods, and like that would be you can say, you know, much more. I don't know, much. It's not. Well, actually, I would say that's not even that difficult to conceive of. It's just that the problem. It's just that like people are more gravitates towards something like utilitarianism or deontological ethics, to call them like that. Because those are in a sense much more easier than conceive of. Like, people see utilitarianism as like this. This is very, you know, this is how, like, you know, I do certain decisions, because it's true. You do certain decisions based on the consequences of like, and sometimes in relation of whether does this maximizes a pleasure or this maximizes my well-being in relation to something like that. You know, so it's not like these things are completely false or bad ways to do things, you know, make decisions about and all that in your life. But these aren't like the ultimate, you know, sort of like principles in themselves. These aren't like the ultimate. This is not the only way that you operate and all that. You're not always like considering simply like the maximization of certain things that you can bring out by consequence and all that. Like, you're not that robotic. you're not always like that robotic when
exactly.
It comes to like, those things like that. But like when it comes to the consideration of quote unquote virtue ethics, you know, like, again, you know, that's more you get to the understanding of like virtues in relations to your disposition and how do you achieve certain goods. What is the application of, like, maybe not the term application, but rather what are like the virtues that you need to exercise, you as, let's say, a student, you know, right now you're going to college, you know, like what are you know, and that is going to make you consider like what is the good that you're trying to reach, and so like the virtues are going to be in relation to like what are the goods that you're going to be what is your ends and all that with it and all that, and
yeah.
so,
And what
like,
I like going back earlier, what you were saying though on Aristotle, and I agree with you 100%. Like, I used to be a consequentialist. That was when I first got into ethics, and I fully subscribe to utilitarianism. Then I later went to deontology, but both of these things are lacking because they deal in absolutes, where you could say there's the virtue continuum, if you will, where there's like, hey, there's over here on the left you have deficiency, over here on the right you have excess. So an example would be like, let's say courage. Courage, I would argue, is in the middle, because on the left of courage, the deficient would be cowardness, but on the right of it would be, you know, foolishness, basically, or like foolhardishness, where you're like doing things that are just gonna get yourself hurt. And you could even say for integrity, like on the left you have corruption, on the right you have like a full, you know, totalitarian legal system, whereas like only this, whereas like, okay, there's some room in this, you can have integrity in the middle. So like jokingly around, if your girlfriend's wearing a dress and she's like, hey, do I look good in this dress? You lie and you're like, yeah, you look good in a dress, you know what I mean? Stuff like that. Like you don't go absolute truth being like, oh no, you look hideous, or no, you look like you lose weight, because no one operates off of these means of being 100% honest like that. Like, but that's where I was just getting on that. Oh yeah, also, fuck utilitarianism. Just want to share it with the room. Thank you. That was just from me, but yeah, if you guys want to chime in too.
Damn, vegans are molding.
Yeah, no, I hate the vegans too. They could. Steve, if you're listening to this podcast, I'm gonna show up to where you live. I'm gonna feed you a steak. Like I'm gonna force feed you a steak, just because you're like so vegan and rub it in my face. I want you to like try one. But yeah, that's off topic.
Have you ever had a Beyond Burger, Sola? You know, Beyond Chicken?
Funny enough, I had it once, and I shit you not, I puked my guts out 30 minutes later. My body naturally rejected the synthetic components of that abomination, what they call meat. And I'm like,
not gonna lie. If you ever had Morningstar, you know.
Listen, I'm not eating like, what's it called, soy slop or something?
Goy
slop. Yeah, goy slop. I'm not eating the goy slop. I'm not gonna consume the bugs.
Wow.
I know John may like consuming the bugs, but me, no. Not me, Chief. I'm good.
Man, no.
I'm actually kind of curious though. We talked on this briefly, but what are your guys' about to go from 0 to 100? But what are your guys' thoughts on the whole like suicide pod things? Because I know John's opinion on it, but do you guys think it's an okay thing to do, or should we have some limitations on it? Are you guys both aware what it is too? Go ahead, Ernest.
Yeah, I think this is going to be like, yeah, obviously a lot different from what you and John probably believe as Catholics, but like, yeah, I'm generally okay with it. Like, if you can demonstrate, you know, like an actual need for it, I think that people who are, you know, suffering from terminal illness, you know, absolutely ravaged with disease and pain, they should sort of get like legal ability to opt out of that without taking matters into their own hands. I'm not opposed to that. Having said that, I can see just myriad ways how this can get like way too messy. So yeah, I don't know. We can open it up from there.
That's something I struggle with a lot too, because I think of examples of like, let's say the military, where I know I had combat medic buddies who tell me they are trained where in wartime, if let's say there's a firefight and someone has like both their like lower half blown clean off, and you know 100% they're gonna die, that it would be acceptable, morally good to like start overdosing them with morphine, so where they die not feeling any pain in their last moments, basically. And I'm curious if John would have to say, would you consider that to be assisted suicide then, where you have a guy like his intestines hanging out, his lower half completely gone, he's bleeding, he's gonna die in like 30 minutes. So do you just let him like excruciatingly die for 30 minutes, like just painful, slow death, or do you give him like the overdose of morphine to where he dies, like let's say in 5 minutes, but he doesn't feel anything, he's just numb and, you know, just out?
Yeah, I think that would be
he's
properly
not
considered
for
to be
it.
suicide.
That's not even assisted suicide.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be like, it'd be like more like a mercy killing or something.
It's not even a mercy killing in
seems
itself,
like the wrong.
too, either.
Wait, why would that not be
like,
suicide though?
Seems like the wrong. No, I mean the guy's not asking to be killed. Presumably, you said he's unconscious. So you're sort of taking matters into your own hands, you know, as the medic, knowing that he won't live. But he doesn't know that, right? So it's not, you know, it's not really suicidal at that point.
Fair enough. I guess that was just a bad analogy at my point. But can you guys see?
No, I think it's fine.
Other
It's an interesting
analogies like
ethical
that?
question.
Yeah, no, I was always curious
I think
about
what you
like,
brought up is yeah.
I don't know, I'm just trying to think in my head what could be an analogy that could actually be difficult to wrestle with for like me and John.
Well, I mean, just, you know, like, just alter the question slightly. Like, you know, the guy knows he's not going to live. He's talking to the medic, and he's asking for him to administer this dose, you know, of morphine that he knows will kill him because he's in incredible pain. And yeah, like, he's not going to survive the next half hour, no matter what they do. You know, like, is that wrong? I don't know. I would argue no. If we're just talking about the medics taking matters in their own hands, yeah, I think there are probably some maybe ethically questionable things there, but still at the same time, like, I don't know, like, what's he gonna do? His alternative, I suppose, is just give him morphine so he doesn't feel pain and just let him bleed out anyway. I guess he could just do that instead.
Yeah, it makes me think about Freud, for example, where he died by, you know, an overdose of morphine because he had mouth, tongue, and throat cancer near the end of his days, and he wrote letters saying, like, every waking day, every moment, I'm in excruciatingly agonizing pain. I just want to die, type thing. Where it's just like, for him, it's like, do you just say, sorry, you're gonna have to let this cancer kill you slowly over an extended period of months or possibly years, or do you, you know, pull the plug, basically? And that's something I wonder about. For, like, you know, Freud, for example, because unfortunately he did end his life through that way. But this goes into even like chemotherapy, for example, because I know there's tons of people who were like doctors to say, like, hey, you have the 50-50 shot to beat this, but if you do chemotherapy, you know, that's your 50-50 right there. But you're gonna be like, in like, if you guys know anyone who goes through chemo, it's gonna suck. Like, you know, chemo's not fun. It's not like you're gonna feel amazing. You're gonna feel weak, tired, and ill. You're gonna lose your hair. Like, it's just all these horrible things that come with it, but you got a chance to, like, beat cancer. Like, can we say it's, like, immoral for a person to deny that care, to be like, oh, you know what, I'm just gonna take it, you know, I'm just gonna die on my own terms, type thing? But what do you think, John?
I mean, I think there's a bit of a distinction of, like, someone, say, like, refusing to take a certain treatment in the expectation, in a sense, that they're going to die. Like, especially when you're kind of sure of it in some respects there. Then someone, you know, actively, you know, trying, you know, taking in, you know, like, for example, like the assisted suicide sort of thing there, and ending it just right there. I don't know. Like, I still find it like a bit something to consider, because again, a lot of people are very troubled about, like, this sort of, like, assisted suicide. No matter what, like, people are kind of most people are really troubled about, like, you know, what this means and all.
It's similar to, like, abortion. Like, you don't. One thing I would get on the pro-life community. I don't think pro-choicers, majority of them, are celebrating or clapping their hands every time they get an abortion. I do know there's a minority of them that do that, and I think they're sick fucks that are gonna burn in hell. But for, like, the rest of them, I think they're just people in an uncomfortable situation, which I would still find to be an immoral action. But it's like, what do you do, type thing. But sorry to cut you off, John. Continue.
I mean, yeah, again, it's something to consider. Like I said, ultimately, I don't think that, like, for example, just to bring back the consent-based thing, I don't think it's very sufficient to answer, like, you know, situations like even like this one, where someone is opting out by their own consent to, you know, die. Because there are also, like, the other implications of whether or not someone, like, who doesn't have anything wrong just wants that. You know, and this you can find with people who, you know, suffer from depression and all that. And, like, and I think that, you know, one of the issues that I have problems with, at least in that occasion, is that, like, this sort of like conceding to an inability of, like, this person, you know, having to go to a situation where it's not simply a medical one, but it's one that, you know, it's much more, I guess you can say, complicated, or in some cases even worse, where like, they just don't have the will to live anymore. And, like, yeah, no, I'm saying this, that, you know, like, this is one of the issues that I take from assisted suicide, where, like, you know, you also can stretch, you know, this on, you know, this sort of, like, resource or like facility to people who don't have really anything wrong, but rather you're just allowing them to like indulge into the lack of will of living instead of actually helping them out. Because I don't think that at that point, like, you're not really helping them out. You're just really conceding to the problem, and that's just not to say mean quotes right now, or intentionally say mean quotes, but that will be very telling of like a society that has literally given up, even if many people are not really opting out for like an assisted suicide situation. But the fact that they're allowing for, even if they will allow it for like for people who have like depression, which again, I'm not trying to diminish like depression or anything like that, or say that it's an easy thing to handle. I'm saying that no, it is hard to handle, especially people in that state, which is why it requires like in a sense much more attention in certain respects to deal with, rather than just kind of like leaving them to just indulge in the lack of will to live. I think it's just very demoralizing to allow that, and that in itself is it's not really going to stop there, to not to make this the whole point, but really that's not really going to stop there on like the issues of whether or not people just simply are okay with it.
Jesus, all I hear is someone's lack of will to live, and that's what I came back to. What?
We're talking about the suicide pods right now.
The suicide pods? Oh man, hell yeah, you get that premium update, someone's like, you know what, don't feel like paying my taxes this year, and it's like, do I got a convenient solution for you? Step into the gate, step into this room for me right here.
Like, man, it's like, say that, but like, I don't know if you guys had caught that one ad that aired when they were like promoting I don't know, like some company that offered services under Canada's MAID program, the medical assistance in dying, and it was like this like just incredibly dystopian commercial about this woman who's got like terminal cancer and all that stuff, but then she's describing like going out on her own terms. Like it's just like set to this like backdrop of like inspirational music and like a montage of her like dancing on the beach in a sundress and all this shit. It just made for such a like bizarre spectacle. I encourage you to watch it.
I know
it'll very
about. Yeah, it's very disturbing.
It'll very much conjure up exactly what you're talking about.
I kid you not, when I first saw that, I thought it was a skit by The Onion, and I'm like, wait, this is actually real. This isn't like something The Onion's doing as a joke. I'm like, oh gosh.
Unironically though, if they happen to do more commercials in the future, I would just like there just to be a low tier God rant.
Oh yeah, low tier God being like, you should kill yourself in the background. Like Morgan Freeman drop in the back, like his face in the clouds, being like, kill yourself. And it's like, it's suicide pods today. I'm like, oh, okay. No, funny enough,
ironically, it seems more human than a fucking just like a cold like pharmaceutical style ad that is the one they actually put out. That would be much better.
Funny enough, really quick, I think you guys all like this. There was an article last year with a Canadian soldier who recently got out and is dealing with their version of the VA, and she's a older woman. I believe she's like 60, and she's been getting assistance by them. And she's like, hey, I live on like, a 2-story house that goes up in stairs, and my bedroom's up there, and I recently had to get a procedure done where I can't go up the stairs. I have one of those like chairs that are hooked up to the side of the stairs that like go up for you, like the conveyor ones, and hers broke. So she wrote to them, was like, hey, I've been writing to you guys for 6 months. Can you send someone here to fix it? And a person responded to her saying like, well, have you considered our assisted suicide programs in Canada? And I'm like, imagine calling an organization and be like, hey, I'm old, decrepit, but I just need help getting up the stairs. Can you help me? And their response to you is like, have you considered killing yourself, basically? It's just very like dystopian. Like, we really just opened Pandora's box for this.
All right, I have 2 hot questions. I wanted to grapple with this, like, some commercials, obviously, there's a naturally very horrific nature to the whole ethical suicide thing. But naturally, commercials are going to try to put forth the best foot when it comes to this. You know, they're like, what about the one lady who's dealing with dementia, who's got cancer, who has no family members around, and her life for the foreseeable future is just looking at tumultuous agony for the next 5 months. Do they have an ethical right to just off themselves? Like, obviously, some of these commercials are strongly put for the case, but I would like to hear y'all objections to that. I'd like to hear y'all brainstorm on that.
I don't believe there's such thing as an ethical suicide. That's just my opinion.
John?
I do believe that it exists, and that it's fine. I just like there is this like very weird, I don't know, like aspect to you know, like marketing it like as a product, and you know, like it's just like I was saying, it's very dystopian. Yeah, I absolutely do believe that it's ethical to offer people the option who are suffering from like just, you know, terminal illness, disease, and constant pain. Yeah, I do think that they should be able to like ethically opt out of that.
Okay.
Would you rather that be through like a doctor though, instead of like a commercial conglomerate making it like something like this?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think it's like I said, I think the commercial is just like psychotic. It's dystopian.
John, what's your thoughts on this? What's your...
Well, I don't have that much thoughts on it. I'm right now trying to play Arkham Knight.
But I want to let you guys know something.
Do
you know, I want to bring this up because I feel like this is apex of accomplishment you could ever have. Have you all heard of Genius? You know, that yellow background they often have for basically industry plans to tell you their beautiful soliloquy about how that woman is popping bags and popping tags. You know that website that constantly tells you the deeper meaning behind shake that ass for me, you know, bend that ass over, let that pussy breathe. You know, that website.
Wait, what the fuck are you talking about right now?
I'm asking you, do you know about this hip hop website that constantly brings on rappers and artists to break down the lyrics? It's called Genius.
Yeah, you could have just said that. You didn't have to say the other stuff. I got you. I was just confused where you're going with it.
Anyway, we have a Hall of Fame assortment of individuals who have been put on here, but I did not know that they had low tier gods. You should kill yourself now rant here. It's
Please don't tell me that's actually a thing on
it's
Genius.
literally on the fucking
I swear, low tier god's been following us since season 1. Like we're now in season 2. We're gonna talk about him in season 3.
I've never been more happy. They unironically put his entire rant on the page. I just have to copy and paste this. I just have to show you this. I thought this was a fake. I'm like, nope, this is the official page for Genius. And they have the low tier god, you should kill yourself now rant there. Also, I love the fact that they put it in brackets. They say spoken word, you know.
Oh gosh.
I love every.
I'm trying to think what else we want to talk about. Ernest, how you been? Hadn't talked to you in a while. Anything new coming up for you? Anything you want to share?
Oh yeah, we always got projects in the works developing, but as per usual, gotta keep that shit on the DL.
Yep, makes sense.
You know, we don't know if any Canadian lawyers may be listening.
Oh yeah, that's gonna be an interesting episode to do.
The day that Sola gets it back in blood. But in terms of go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I was just talking to myself.
Well, two things. Recently, have you guys been paying attention to the runs right now? I've been paying attention to currently the candidates, and you know, the races are off right now. So I'll be doing a little bit of canvassing in my local area. Being that voter guy, like you should vote now. You know,
that's actually a question. Yeah, who do you guys think's gonna win 2024? Like, do you think Biden is, or do you think Trump's gonna pull a Hail Mary and just like dunk on this? Or there could be a third option. We don't know.
Man, who knows? Like, it's a coin flip at this point. like you could make, but like I think it does really just come down to, at least in this case, probably a lot of the geopolitical situation, right? Like if this stuff with Israel and Gaza, ends sooner, I guess, rather than later. If Biden can convince the Saudis to turn on the fucking reserve tap and start flooding the market with more petrol and lower gas prices, then yeah, maybe he's looking pretty good to win. But if he can't get any of those things to occur, and it's still ongoing, and fucking maybe Trump's boys tell the Saudis to actually hold back production even more, increase the price, then yeah, I think it's more likely Biden will lose.
I can just imagine Trump sending a bunch of Saudi OPEC
and people
guys.
won't even ascribe those to.
But can you see Trump sending a bunch of Saudi guys, the OPEC people, smoking a fat stogie and being like, you know what, raise those gas prices up more. I'm gonna need this, and just to screw over Biden and be like, it's a necessary cost for me to get reelected.
I mean, if the Saudis do feel that Trump is the better bet as far as their security goes, as far as getting done what they have wanted to get done for a while, securing an agreement from the U.S. to do direct intervention if Iran does. If Biden's not willing to do that, then yeah, they might just go ahead and just suppress production even more than they have, and see gas prices go up I don't know, $4 a gallon or whatever average.
I already told this to Hazy.
That'll tank his fucking chances for sure.
Oh, definitely. No, I was already talking to Hazy of this on an episode we pre-recorded, being like, hey, I don't really have much of a say or care in that. It'd be funny if Trump won again. I'd laugh at that, knowing our country's going to hell in the handbasket quicker. But to me, anytime I look at democracy, where we are currently, it's the meme where it's vote Moloch, don't vote Ball. And then the other side is a red guy saying vote Ball instead, don't vote for Moloch. And I'm like, okay, so you guys are just asking me to vote for Ball or Moloch. I'm not voting for either of these dudes because they're shitty.
Oh dear God, Sola wants me to have a fucking connection call.
I mean, look, man, I'm still not convinced that democracy is a good system. It's just, I'm not convinced at all. I'm not trying to be rude to you, Hazy, because I know you like it, but it's just all democracy does is cause division amongst people and create tribalism. That's all it really succeeds in doing.
Well, just to feel in a bit of the tension here and all that, going and related back to what we were talking about, fascism, the same thing in some ways can be applied to the term democracy, because every time I hear someone say, "Oh, this is a threat to democracy," all things. Every time I hear someone say this is a threat to democracy, all I'm hearing is something completely else, because these people are just either very paranoid over some idealized sort of understanding of how things should be. Oh, these things are not following the our progressive utopia. Our candidate did not win or something like that. This is a threat to democracy. This sort of term democracy has really been the way that it's being used, especially a lot being used. It's both Democrats and Republicans, but the way that Democrats emphasize on this sort of idea and all that, it really has no bare relation to the way that democracy was understood, or democratic principles were understood since even the founding in itself. And all that.
It's kind of this thing by Joe Biden. Joe Biden's no, it's liberals do this where they say vote for Joe Biden to save democracy. While in the same breath, if end stroke, removing Trump's name from ballots. So I'm okay, this is just bullshit.
Vote Joe Biden to try to save our degenerate utopia or something like that. That's literally what I'm hearing every time I see these sort of concerns for democracy. And even though you can see the whole situation in 2020 with the voting stuff and all that, most of these people don't care about the way that the process in itself or whatever and all that. It's just a means to be able to get what they want and all. So that's what I mean about that. I'm not in disagreement with Sola's sort of way of saying I don't believe in democracy, because I myself I don't believe in democracy, but not necessarily in the sense. Listen, I don't believe in democracy I don't believe in democracy in this sort of way of just simply just saying that democracy is just simply anti-totalitarianism. It's simply voting, because
More
this
people
was
need
never
this
really
right
the
here.
understanding.
More people need this. This little boy right here. Oh, you see
Listen,
this? Yeah, Hazy, you need a copy of this, buddy.
My God, not sure.
But listen, the democracy was always properly understood to be a sense of a facet of like what it, like a systems. But properly speaking, democracy is the term, like where it comes from, like demos, or I don't know how to actually pronounce it. It literally means the rule of the common people. And
Etymology now?
Properly speaking, to have a democracy, you're supposed to have a common people. And to have a common people is not simply to live in the same place. It's to have the same sort of...
Mr. John, quick question. Would you go as far as to say that democracy is the god that
Don't
failed?
alley-oop this, man. Shut up.
So,
okay,
can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I would just like to say, would you go as far and dare say that democracy is the god that failed? I'm just kind of curious where I'm quoting that from.
If this was maybe like 5 years ago, I probably would be unabided, unquestionably would say yeah, but no.
Let's go.
Because no, if this was 5 years ago, I would say yeah, but no, I won't even say that. I mean, like it's again, like I said, like if we're to properly speak of democracy, is to have the rule of a common people. To have a common people is to have the same ethos, is to have like the same aspirations. What I just said right now, I'm just being redundant right now. Is to have like something that binds us together. That we say that even though we have our differences in some respects, we are a one people. We're not just like a collection of units that we just call society. We have a history. We come together, and we are trying to strive towards something. We may not be clear as to what that something is, but we are at least working towards trying to make that work. Anyway, so that's what I would say. Like, but this is not what the average Democrat thinks. They're just thinking like, voting system, progressivism. That's what they think of democracy and all that. And this is why I hate about like this term democracy for the most part, like the way that it's being used in general around. It really has lost any sort of like authentic significance to what it means to have. Because if the case was like that, I mean, like it's just simply voting and all that, and there's no consideration of like, us as like a unified, people and anything like that. Whatever, dude, this is just all of this is just crap. I mean, it's just the embracement of. This is what my dad says. It's just the embracement of mediocrity at that point on. Yeah.
Interesting. Gotta hit the pose that Hazy has.
What's the actual distinction you're drawing between like the original conception of the definition and how people would commonly use it now, right? As far as just some sort of rule of will of the populace.
Yeah.
I think Diogenes says it best that democracy is the mother of all tyrants. If you want to go back to the classics, so yeah.
Diogenes is a stupid woman, and I'm a misogynist. Anyway, so the thing I wanted to point out here was I thought was interesting is I do believe in democratic rule, and it is the will of the people, but I do believe that there is a almost a yin and yang to like how democracy works to some degree. I think that both of these sides are supposed to pull each other in some regards, and I think that not having a unified voice can also be bring forth a level of humility when it comes to our systems, and it often begs us to ask why that is. Somebody may disagree with you on some sort of fundamental basis or grounds, and often asks us to revisit these notions or ideas that are staples or inherent notions of like how government ought to be functioning. But when people talk about just government or the threat to democracy, I think any situation in which people are discussing the will of people being revoked from others and are living in an alternate, like at least no one here, but But say, for instance, Trump, for instance, has almost all of his legal advisors tell him as to what had occurred the day he lost the election, and even the day he won the election, he still espoused voter fraud. So the dissemination of like distrust within the electoral system definitely is creating animosity amongst the main populace. And if there was any poison to what democracy was, I think those sort of sentiments riding on for years on end was definitely a poison to the population at large and democracy as a whole. So John wanted to say something, so
Yeah, I mean,
did those things just? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Actually, you go first.
Like, did those things just spontaneously manifest, like, you know, in and around Trump, or are they speaking to like previously existing issues that had gone unaddressed for so long? And why, like, because don't get me wrong, like the idea, the definition of democracy is fine. Of course, it could be implemented in a variety of ways. I don't have any problem with it. Sure, we could probably get into like an argument or debate about like what system is actually best for governance, but I think democracy like generally is fine. I think most people would probably say it's pretty plain that we don't have anything that even resembles like rule by the will of the people. So like to that effect, it's like, do we even have it? We could, sort of circle back around to the original topic of, how we've just totally gotten lost in the weeds in calling everything fascist. Like we do similar things with democracy, right? Like we call something democracy that very plainly is not. I don't understand why we do this. I don't understand why we necessarily hold it up, as something so sacrosanct and untouchable in this country, at least. Can't speak for others.
I think that there are appropriate. I think that there are appropriate ways. Yeah, I think that there are appropriate ways to like speak of like will of the people in some ways, and there are ways to be able to describe something democratic, but at least in sense of principles and all that. Because again, I don't think that democracy is just merely voting. For the longest of time, like it was never one and the same with universal suffrage, for example. Like Athenian democracy, whether or not that term may be anachronistic at this point, I don't think it is anachronistic, but Athenian democracy was not like all Athenians, all people who live in Athens or had a say. Athenian democracy was Athenians had a say. To be an Athenian citizen, is something that was a privilege. But not everybody who was in Athens was an Athenian citizen. And so, like, that's what I mean about that. Democracy does actually have significance, and I do think that like there are democratic principles that apply in some way similar to that in America. But like the way that people use it nowadays is people have lost that sort of sense of like a tradition that is able to like make this a bit explicit, because we are thinking of democracy as the same as voting or something that is like not a centralized system, quote unquote, or something like that. Which again, like these things don't even apply to the way that the contemporary state is, or even how it was about like maybe 200 years ago or so. Like democratic principles is something to uphold. But it's not like these sort of idealized ways of like looking at society that allows for the vote, that every vote counts or something like that. No, there are more fundamental principles that guide those things. Again, like I did spoke about like the common people part, but that goes all along to the understanding not as a monoculture. I was more just speaking more as like that there is something that even though people can have their disagreements on certain things, they are not in disagreement on the most fundamental things that can be able to unify them as the striving for the good of the society, which again sometimes it's not always clear at first, but these are things that people work on together to be able to achieve. These are things, like these aren't merely abstract principles. These are things that speak directly to the experience of how one goes every day in relation to the other person and their neighbor and all that. It's much more difficult to talk about it nowadays because, again, we have universal suffrage and we have like things. And again, I'm not speaking as like universal suffrage in the sense of like repeal the 19th. I'm not talking about that. All I'm just speaking is that the way that universal suffrage has changed the way that people conceive of what it means to have like uphold democratic principles, and the way that, you know, like we already are so interconnected with the world that we have like different groups, ethnic groups at the same time, you know, clashing with one another's, to the point that, like, you know, you have like this pluralistic society. A lot of these things, you know, like the application of democratic principles becomes very obscured at this point. And so like that's what I mean. It's like you know, it's not just merely the consideration of history, like, you know, just looking up the definitions of before. It's more like the retracing of one's own, you know, like what's one's own heritage, being an American citizen, being in a, you know, or in this maybe in some cases being a European citizen and all that. It's not really just simply about voting. It's not having to craft out the best system. I don't think democracy is the same as systems that Sola sometimes speaks about it. I'm thinking about it more in the sense of principles, guiding principles that speak to what it is that, you know, unites an entire group of people. And,
yeah, but you could still have common law and common good without the notion of democracy, and that's where our disagreement is. Where you're saying just has to be there. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that view.
No. What I'm saying here is not that you cannot have like the notion of common law or that without democracy. All I'm saying is that to even have democracy, you need to have like these things hashed out in some way. You need to have these things perpetuated into the minds of the people in some way, you know, and in some way through like civic duties, you know, like being able, like maybe not necessarily like reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, but that's kind of like to point out at least what I'm speaking about, like the way that these things are perpetuated, you know, to say that, you know, we are American citizens, we are a group of people. This is about much more newer phenomena, because even in America, like colonies did not see themselves all as a unified sort of like homogenous groups. They were all coming from different backgrounds, but in the end of the day, they did eventually come down to say that we are one nation at some point and all that. That doesn't mean that all conflicts were completely resolved, but at least it opened up a space for like these even if there is conflict, you know, there is a way that we can there is a way that these things can be managed, given something that we can all agree on, in at least fundamentally. So that's what I mean about that. In
that makes
that
more
sense,
sense.
there.
Still with that going off of it, it's just Hazy even said it briefly earlier. It's going to address that, where it's like it's a yin and yang. I don't believe in this yin and yang or this like dichotomy of democracy, no democracy. And that's a very much like you addressed as a view of like modern liberalism, where it's like if you don't have democracy, it's that, or like, you know, big bad authoritarianism. I don't agree with that distinction. And I had two guests on my podcast a while back, and they were both like liberal Democrats, social democrats. The entire first 30 minutes was them praising democracy, preaching we need more liberalism, more democracy. And it was to the point where I just flat out asked them why. Why do we need these things? And they were so stunned by me asking this question. They're like, oh, because so we don't have a dictatorship, of course, so we don't have a tyranny. I'm like, yeah, but I don't agree if it's a black and white dichotomy, because I'm sure we could agree that there's nations that have a democracy but are still more tyrannical, I would argue, than nations without a democracy, in a sense where like the people have more of a say even if they're not voting. And that's an issue I have with a lot of this like liberal dichotomy dilemmas, in a sense.
Yeah, but so I do reject the dichotomizing of like that you either have totalitarianism or democracy. But again, the reason why I reject it is not because there's a middle way. It's just more I just reject it because I don't take democracy in that sort of way of bracketing it as a system of voting or a system of just merely a system of governments and all that. That's what I'm trying to say on that. And again, you know, America is a democracy in many ways a traditional sense of what that term means, but not in the same way that like a lot of libs nowadays speak about it, although you can probably say that it gravitates towards that, given the way that like there is a sort of a guiding narrative on some of this stuff. But anyway, you know, like all I'm just saying is that, you know, like the whole notion of like a state that is, you know, democratic in this sort of like you know, this way of like, oh, we have organized voting and stuff like that, all we need to is just, you know, extend suffrage or something like that. That's not what I think of like democracy in that sense there. I think it's more
What exactly do you think democracy like is exactly like, or like what if you were to succinctly describe your contention with current democracy would it be?
Yeah, just in that sense that there is a common people, and, in some sense, there is a rule that comes with that common people. Although I don't,
Would you say that?
although that in itself, I don't see it as in contrast of, like, say, elitism, for example. Because even like in democratic societies and all that, there's always like elites. There's always like a guiding elite in some respects there. Like, those are things that I think that they don't have. I don't think that there is like a contradiction in saying that we are a democracy, but we also have, like, say, an aristocracy, or we have, like, these groups of elites, noble elites, whatever. Maybe not noble elites, but we do, like, say, like family elites or something like that.
So would you say it's fair to say that, like, in like most societies as they exist, there is no like common people?
Well, no. Like, I mean, like, there was, like, common peoples, and it's just that, like, as like, things develop, and as, like,
you say common people, what do you mean
interconnected and all that, you get like these sort of changes, and you have to sort of accommodate to some of these changes, really. But that doesn't necessarily do away of that's a way of the notion of a common people. It's just that things become much more these things need to be attended for and all that. This is one of the issues that I have with this whole notion of America as a melting pot, while not really answering the question of what exactly is it that is uniting us. It's mostly just like deterring the actual, like, things, all these things, and just causes more conflict and all that. Like, I mean, like, deferring, like, the question to just say that we embrace diversity, and then just simply avoid, like, the most fundamental things of, like, yeah, but what keeps us together?
I think it's
assimilation is what you need, definitely. I would say assimilation. Like, one more thing, and I'll let Hazy speak. Yeah,
what was Hazy saying?
I'm gonna die.
Go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off, man. My ADD brain be kicking in sometimes, or I just blank. Go ahead, you're good, and then let's go, Ernest.
Just something earlier that was said that, like, yeah, I believe that some ideas in terms of voters or voter fraud, in the heaviest quotation marks I could ever espouse here, definitely can be a belief, an idea of the people, but certain ideas are absolutely emboldened by larger figures. In fact, the validity of such ideas can be emboldened by larger figures. The dominance of one example is Kanye West, for instance, and how Jewish fervor became a very, like, topical discussion, and the validity of the existence of these powers that destroyed his life, in quotation marks again, became more of a valid subject matter, not because it was just somebody talking about it, but it was Kanye West agreeing with the notion. We had Kyrie Irving coming forth speaking about being the true Israelites, and so sure, we can all believe and conceive of the notion that voter fraud wasn't like birthed from Donald Trump as a concept or idea, but someone with an influence and with a social media presence at the time period, Twitter, of having 50 million followers, 50 million followers on Twitter at the time period, definitely emboldens people to believe that this is the case, especially when you have the person within the head of office declaring as much. It's like, well, if the person who is literally the president is saying this much, clearly there is some evidence that could be found. It just never was. But when you was,
but still, you don't put the blame on them. That's like me saying I blame Beyonce's fans for attacking Taylor Swift's fans. No, it was like I say I blame Beyonce for her fans attacking Taylor Swift's fans. I'm like, okay, but Beyonce didn't attack them. That was her fans. Then if you flip it around and say, like, well, I blame, Taylor Swift for her fans attacking Beyonce fans. Like, no, I don't blame either of them. It's the people committing these actions. Like, I agree with you. You have Kanye or Trump say these things, but at the end of the day, the responsibility lies in the action of the people, what they do. Like, I don't blame January 6th on Trump. I blame it on the people who showed up and tried to do that stuff. I'm not blaming the figure. I'm blaming the people committing the action,
Okay, diametrically opposed entirely on that notion, because I believe that there is something there is a level of credence. All right, just in terms of just building a bridge, in terms of like an idea being given a higher level of credence, do you believe that like public figures can do so? like to the populace at large? Do you think that popular figures can give an idea credence more than it ever would have had it just been discussed in common parliaments?
It depends with what the person's known for. So, like, I'm not going to take the Kyrie Irving and basketball players serious, same as I don't take Kanye serious, because at the end of the day, they're not politicians or anything like that. And if you want me to be,
like, for example, even just using the one that you brought up, and like, I'm not trying to like make some like you know, like big like attack on democracy point about fucking January 6th, give a shit, but like, do you think that any of that occurs without Trump? And to that effect, like, because you're saying like you don't blame him, you blame the people doing the action, but if he doesn't, like, you know, do all the things that he does, like leading up to it, does the action, you know, by all these individuals end up occurring? I mean, I would argue probably not. So in that sense, like, doesn't,
I mean, there were
culpability lie with him?
Yeah, but to be fair, there were people showing up regardless of Trump, even before he said that. And that's the thing where this goes into speculation, because we don't know simply where.
Question.
Like,
you said there were people already showing up. What were they motivated by?
They were going to talk about, you know, the election, like what people do all the time. Like, I don't know if people don't notice, but protesting at Washington is not a new phenomenon. People do that all the time. Like,
I don't think anyone's espousing that it was. I don't think anyone's espousing that it is, but I believe that at the very least, that Trump undoubtedly emboldened more people that there ever conceivably would have been to go down there and discuss voter fraud as a legitimate form of an occurrence.
Yeah, but
that
I'm saying, even if he's emboldened, that doesn't give justification to blame Trump, though. That's still blaming the people. Like, if, let's say, me and you were standing on a sidewalk and there was, like, you know, a guy on the other side of the road, and some celebrity walks up to me and you, let's say Tom Cruise, and is like, hey, you know, Hazy, hey, Sola, how you doing? And like, oh, Tom Cruise, holy shit, man, what's up? And he's like, yeah, hey, go over there and punch that guy in the face. And then you're like, what? And he's like, yeah, I'm Tom Cruise, listen to me, go over there and punch him in the face. And you end up doing that. You're not going to go to court and say, Your Honor, Tom Cruise told me to punch the man in the face. And the judge is going to be like, oh, by golly, if that's the case, my apologies, you're good to go, sir. We need to get this Tom Cruise figure. Like, that's silly, that's ridiculous. You were the guy at the end of the day punched the dude in the face.
I would totally agree with you if it was just Tom Cruise, a random celebrity, just saying these things and espousing these things. However, the problem is with someone like Kanye West, there's still an issue. Two things. There is still an issue
let's
because
replace Tom Cruise with
hold on.
Donald Trump. Then would that change the scenario for you? Like, would you think it's more justified?
Well, hold on, because I don't think Hazy or I are suggesting that like the people who were doing crimes or whatever shouldn't be charged, you know, on January 6th. Because Trump exists and like was, you know, like whatever, like saying all kinds of crazy shit that probably led them to come down there, of course they should still be charged with the crime. That doesn't change the fact that like he still did that, and it's probably more likely that they end up there as a result and end up doing those crimes as a result of, you know, like his insistence the election was stolen or whatever the fuck. I don't know. I don't think that's.
I'm sorry if I'm giving you guys pushback. It's just I don't want this line of logic to be like some victimhood mentality where it's like, okay, there's your excuse to do it. You know, Trump said so, therefore I'm okay. Like, I still think no. Like,
I think they deserve. I think that both of them deserve repercussions for the behaviors. At this point, I'm not saying that these people are just innocent, that they made the decision. They definitely deserve to be prosecuted to the furthest extent of the law. And even though, as a person who's been following this diligently, a lot of the people haven't actually been prosecuted severely. So I think that they are showing these people a bit of leniency. However, I would think a more apropos comparison to the Tom Cruise thing that was brought up earlier is that surely you wouldn't think, okay, why is Tom Cruise saying this? He's literally an actor. I have no reason to believe that I'm under threat of violence or I have any reason to
flip it with instead of Tom Cruise, Donald Trump, or Joe Biden, or any political figure.
I just 1 second.
Like,
but it was like say for instance, there was an FBI agent that was telling you that, hey, this person is going to enact violence on you unless you basically preemptively act in this situation. You would take that with having far more credence if there was somebody you already trust and you already have a buy-in of believing that they're giving you you their word, you would have more of a trust to act in that manner. Not to say that you are divorced from all consequences that come as a byproduct of that, but I believe that there is a certainly more intense responsibility on that individual, because they know better than that person in that case, because they have information they have access to than the common person. Donald Trump at the time period had more information and more access than the common person, and still said that you need to fight for your country. You're not going to have a country by the time this is all said and done, and you need to go down there and basically protest June 6th. And this is why people were saying things like hang my pants. This is why people were had a proclivity towards violence, because if we accept the notion that these people trusted Trump to the T, to his letter, to everything he had said up to that point, then it only makes sense that you would think, oh, we only did this the way we were supposed to, through the democratic mean, and they're already stealing it. But the powers that be are stealing it. There is no alternative that is accessible to you other than using violence. Like it's the it's like the most logic regression there. And so that's why I think that Donald Trump has a higher level of responsibility when it came to what occurred that day.
Would you apply this?
I'm not suggesting that he's responsible. I'm not suggesting he's necessarily responsible for violence that occurs. What I'm saying is that I doubt that most, if not all, of those people would have ended up there had he not been saying since whatever November 5th that it was rigged.
In 2016,
it's a fake election. So that's just kind of my point. I'm not saying that. I don't know. Who knows? Whenever all this court cases are wrapped up, perhaps the story will be different. But incitement. Incitement is a tough thing to prove. So I don't think, at least with the information that we have now, that the evidence is there that he'll be convicted on that specifically. But that's something to change, obviously.
Let me ask you a scenario, though, that actually is practical then, where this is reason to bring in doubt, because I'm sure all of us here could agree, just because someone's in a position of authority doesn't mean they're infallible, they're always right. I'm sure we could all agree that. So this goes to the issue where I find it where it's take credence to what they say. I don't fully agree if that's perfect example. When COVID was at its peak and people were pushing Fauci really hard to lock, doors up, stay inside. And then one of the founders of MDMA and mRNA, all these stuff, he went on Joe Rogan's podcast, be hey, a lot of what Fauci's pushing is actually bullshit. I'm qualified to speak in this subject. Here's my counter sources. And because of that, he was canceled, shut down, and brought to oblivion. It's only until recently now we're oh, a lot of what the original guy is saying was right and Fauci was wrong. But Fauci was working with the government and pushing out the government saying do everything that Fauci says. So to the extent, I believe it could be a justified thing, even if it's not a position of power. You don't know until it happens, example. Let's just play a crazy scenario. I don't know. Let's say Kanye or something like that, or the Kyrie guy. If 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, there's groundbreaking evidence that, his position that they were the original Israelites is 100% objectively true. Would that be justified then that we criticize, basically crucified Kyrie Irving on a stake to be he's wrong, he's not allowed to say this thing? That's the issue I'm getting at with us relying so heavily on government's approval basically of what is right and what is wrong. I feel it could be a balance, but I'm not on board if it's a whole agreement of okay, Trump is X, Y, and Z, therefore shut him down. No, we cut him. Or Trump was, wrong about the ballot stuff. What's to say 10, 15, 20 years down the road, of course, speaking purely hypothetical right now, there was groundbreaking, damning evidence against the Biden administration that actually it was fraudulent, it was hacked. What do we do from there then? That's my question for you guys. What do you do if when you're told a narrative and your narratives end up broken and showing wrong later down the road? That's why I'm saying we should be a little bit more critical of this and not always agree with what Big Daddy government tells us.
Okay, I'm gonna let you speak first, actually. Go ahead.
Yeah, so basically, I mean, we only know what we know at the time, right? So that's why I'm trying to give you this without any particular spin. I know for a fact that people were at J6 and a small minority of them did actual crimes or whatever. I know that Trump gave a speech. I also know that he was, like very resistant to legitimacy of the election since the, early onset of November. Whether or not like there's legitimacy to his, claims, I haven't seen like, any of the sort of stuff that you're talking about. If that comes out decades later, then obviously I would change my position on whether I thought that like he was right in doing so, or whether he, I guess he would still maintain like culpability.
Would you agree that we could show discretion for the possibility of someone being right now?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I agree with what you're saying, though. We only know what we know now. Yeah. No, Ernest, I agree. We only know what we know now. But I put a little asterisk on that, like, well, there could be a possibility, even though we don't know it exactly right now, in the future, that X, Y, or Z could change. And that's my issue with a lot of modern politics. People don't have the X, Y, or Z.
Conviction overturned.
Yeah. Yeah, it's basically like very like solid black and white. Like, okay, this is what we have now. It's infallible, objective. It's never going to change. And it's very dogmatic in principle. I just disagree with.
Okay. So I don't think my position was ever like just completely and holistically have the notion of big daddy government, but I think even with the guy who went on Joe Rogan's podcast, I don't think he was like the birthplace of like NRA like vaccines. I think he had some knowledge, but I don't know like to what regard the accuracy of his objections were. I would have to probably look it up a little bit later. But what I will say to this is that the indictments very clearly stated out that Trump had every right to be skeptical of the election. He had every right to oppose the results, and he did exercise almost every avenue accessible to him up to that point. The problem and where these indictments come from is when a level of incredulity is used to the extent where it feels like there is a bad faith operative within our democratic processes. So, such as using the individuals, okay, cool. That's somebody call me, I know it. Using the individuals who had been gathered at that time period to stall the election. And mind you, the crowd of individuals were out there for hours on end until Trump told them to go home. And someone had been shot as a consequence of everything had occurred at that point. So when I look at this and think, oh, they literally show that this indictment is not saying, oh, you can't not say that the election is not fraud. The problem is that you have a slate of electors try to basically upheave our system. And even places like Fox News, I had I think $8 billion, how much exactly? $8 billion lawsuit as a byproduct of this, where he had to basically implicitly give the admission that they knew that the election wasn't stolen. And so there's massive media conglomerates, news outlets that are pushing this to the people at large. And we can often argue the notion of, well, perhaps 20 years, 40 years, whatever that could be, and say there's a possibility of being wrong. But I feel like that doesn't really engage with the plethora of like evidence we have now. At some point, someone can say, my car at some point will stop working. At some point, it may be, and I can give credence to that notion, but I don't think that's a justification to be exhaustively unconvinced about what we have in front of us as to the operatives within a given system. And I think that's a reason why it's cause to say that Donald Trump acted in bad faith. And I think it's also a good reason to say that January 6th deserved criminal charges for what they did that day. So I don't think it I think I just wanted to tackle that whole idea of like maybe 20 years down the line, like it could be the case. And I think that that creates like an exhaustive level of skepticism where I could say, I don't have to concede to anything that currently exists in terms of our information, because there might be an undisclosed time period within the given future that might vindicate me of everything. I don't know.
like presumably you're leaving the possibility open, but I don't know. Let's get on to brass tacks here. You think he's getting convicted or not? I got 5 bills riding on this that he's not to get convicted.
Yeah,
at least for anything that he did while he was in office. Yeah. So like I said, I got 500 on this. That he's not going to be.
Hey, can I get on that bet with you and agreeing with you? Like, he's not getting convicted.
What we betting though? We betting men around these parts? We betting men around these parts?
Oh, I already made I already made the bet. You and Hazy should do one right now.
Listen, Hazy, I may be a good Catholic boy, but I have a very chronic gambling addiction. I'll gamble on anything.
I got $40 on it right now. I got
$4? All right, virtually shaking your hand right now. So
virtually shake my hand, sir. Shake my hand. All right, there you go. Right now.
Hey, for the record, this is season 2 finale. So yeah, I just shook Hazy's hand virtually. $4. He's not going to get convicted. Wait, really quick. What are we setting his timeline to? Like date? How long do we give him? Like to the end of his trial or like what?
Well, actually, hold on. I'll clarify. The terms of the bet that I've got going right now are actually it's $100 if he's convicted for anything he did while president. I don't think he will. And then $500 if he goes to prison. Again, this is only applicable to things he did while president. So like the stealing documents or like whatever he's accused of doing, that wouldn't count under this. So you guys do whatever you want. And
I like that one. Do you want to do that? Do you want to do those terms, Hazy?
They seem pretty sound. Yeah, I'm totally down for this.
Yeah.
I'm gonna spend your money on a riding with a Biden hat.
Oh, that's disgusting. Yeah. Wait, actually, one moment. I think I may have this dusty in my closet from a long time ago.
Oh, brother, this man's gonna make me puke.
Yep, I still got her.
Oh, brother, I already know. I already know what type of hat this man's about to pull out.
Yep.
Oh, brother, this.
Oh yeah, this right there.
Sucks.
You know.
Man.
This is
a joke earlier about you like Solo getting to like MAGA 2024 shit, but damn, look at you now.
This is from 2016, ladies and gentlemen. This is a classic relic I found while going through our military stuff. Right here, Make America Great Again hat. From when I still believed in democracy and in statism and in all these government things, when I still had hope for the system. But you know, me, I'm enlightened. I'm enlightened. I'm no longer a status cuck, so I don't gotta worry about that stuff. So this is just a relic of the past for me. But yeah, this. No, I just found it funny that I actually did find is like digging through my old stuff. That was
These are actually check this.
Yeah. Oh gosh.
Holy shit. But for everyone at home, you know, we've been chatting for an extensive period of time. But
oh yeah, we've been talking a while.
Listening to another episode of Requiem Radio. We had a little bit of a scuffed impromptu debate to make up for, you know, debates that don't occur. But I'm glad that everyone can have a bit of a chuckle, a bit of a ha-ha at the end of the day. I'm Hazy Dialects. I'm here with John. I'm here with Evan. I don't know what he got in here, but he's here.
That was Robinson. That's my boy Robinson. He just pulled up randomly. Hey Robinson, say what's up. You're recording right now.
What's good, y'all?
Hey, make sure really quick, tune in to Robinson's episode on why academia was hijacked by the left. That was a very fun episode. So, yeah, who else? Let me see. What's up? Yeah, let's do closing stuff. Yeah, go ahead, John, and then Ernest.
Yep, we can have our closing statements from all of our members who decided to join us in an impromptu conclusion. I appreciate all of you spending your time here chatting up with us. Despite my co-host trying to call me a government cup, I'm not. But
I'm sorry, I had to throw a little shade there. No bad blood, Hazy.
Go ahead. The parting words first.
Yeah, this was happy hour, so everything that we said was null and void, just to keep it on record here. Yeah.
In Minecraft, yeah, the whole conversation was in Minecraft. Yo, Ernest, what do you got for us, man? Ernest.
Man, at the end of the day, don't vote for either of these motherfuckers. No, I'm playing.
Amen.
Do whatever you want, man. I don't give a shit. Solo, don't vote for the Catholic guy. I guess I don't know.
Yeah, my ballot ticket is for Taylor Marshall. No, I'm joking. I don't want to get killed by Catholic Twitter for saying that. That was completely a joke. So, yeah. Robinson, I know you joined very, very, very last minute, but you want to say any closing remarks just for you being here?
Yeah, y'all are probably all a bunch of communists, and you guys need to be physically removed.
Good. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right. No, funny enough, like all three of you guys. Yeah. No, it's kind of funny because all three of these people, John, Ernest, and Robinson, have been on our podcast once. So, congrats, you three are officially the first three guests that are reoccurring now. So this is your second time being on. So, shout out to you guys for that. But yeah, that's all from me, Hazy. Anyone else want to say like last minute things?
And
have a good year. We'll see you in November when that bet rolls around.
Oh yes, sir. I'm gonna recruit. Yes, sir. Wait, I'm using that word improperly. Anyway, it's Hazy Dialects, and as the episode ends, you've seen this all in HD.